AI has the potential of almost being your own personal nuclear reactor. Now, how comfortable would you feel if I told you that a little Timmy down the block has a nuclear reactor in his basement? I don't think you'd be that happy. Everybody understood what a nuclear weapon is. AI is much worse than a nuclear weapon because it can be insidious, it's fast, it can spread very rapidly, it can affect us in ways that, is unimaginable at this point.
Welcome to AI to Z. Hosted by AirSwift's Chief Revenue Officer, Anna Frazzetto, we delve into artificial intelligence, health tech, and more. Tune in and journey with us into the future.
Well, welcome everyone. Today, I get to have some fun with Bane Hunter, who is an industry leader when it comes to product development, creation, invention. He's worn multiple hats ranging from chief product officer to executive director to CEO of several companies. Bane and I, we first met in a Viacom meeting, and one of the things that struck me is that, Bane, you always kind of questioned what was accepted by others as the norm. And I knew we were going to hit it off immediately. So that curiosity has led you to 2 successful IPOs, 8 product patents, and now you're deep in the throes of the world of the AI. So welcome, Bane.
Thank you, Anna. You bring back fond memories. I think it's appropriate to some extent, especially since Paramount Global Viacom, aka MTV, just got sold. So it's kind of like the end of an era, and you're absolutely right. I've been extremely fortunate to work with some fantastic companies, but even more importantly, to actually work with some remarkable individuals that, we learned a lot from. And I'll just kind of segue briefly, since we're talking about Paramount Viacom. Somebody had just posted the video when Tom Preston had left Viacom, and how we all actually rushed down and were clapping, were enthusiastic about it. And he was actually let go by Sumner Redstone, who was founder of Viacom, because he wouldn't buy MySpace. Sumner thought that Tom made the mistake of not buying MySpace. And, in hindsight, you look at it and you go, innovators and leaders sometimes pay a huge price for being right. And they're not necessarily shown as being right until well down the road. So it's unfortunately one of those things that I always tell people: if you want to really be at the spear tip of innovation or change, you are going to sometimes have to pay a very, very hefty price. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a fantastic time.
It really is. And and probably a great way for us to kind of start our conversation, because, you and I, we spoke briefly before getting together to record the podcast. And it's like, where do we start? There's just so much that we can talk about. But I think a good place to start is just AI deployments and utilization in general. I think AI is becoming, is becoming an integral part of many industries. So from your perspective, where do you see the most impactful opportunities for AI deployment, and how should companies approach integrating AI into their operation? And I guess lastly, what kind of timelines should you, expect to see some tangible results?
Great question. And unfortunately, there's no simple answer, but we'll try to address a few of them. So, AI to some extent has become the buzzword, right? Everybody wants to have AI attached to their organization or to their workflows, or to be able to tell their clients that they're working with AI. First thing that I would say is, well, before we get to that, let's talk about 2 things. One, what's your business objective? What's the outcome that you're trying to seek? When are you trying to achieve that, outcome? And are you prepared to pay the price for it? So that's the first step. The second step is really understanding what AI is. I think a lot of people misunderstand what AI is, and they'll sometimes confuse it with machine learning, which is fine, or automation. So AI, obviously, I think we are in a golden age. We are probably at the cusp of another, let's call it, humongous transformation from humanity. Whether you want to go back in time and talk about the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the advent of the computers, I think AI is really going to be doing, and is doing the same thing. Now, the industries obviously that can be impacted and are impacted are, well, I don't think there's going to be an industry that it's not going to be impacted, but some of the key ones, for example, are finance, media, retail, healthcare especially, I think is going to be seeing a lot of benefits associated with it. In some aspect as well, security, what I would call social economics, are going to be impacted significantly. There are some countries, and I won't name them in the world, that are already using AI to effectively have social scores for individuals that, should we say, operate in their ecosystems. So I think in that respect, AI can and will be utilized against a broad spectrum. But the key here is, what do you want it to do? Right. So let's talk about a couple of examples. Healthcare. One of the key aspects of healthcare is obviously avoiding human error, being able to go through massive quantities of data, massive quantities of results, and effectively having a system, having an AI that is going to learn as you go along, obviously with more data, and effectively also reduce the level of error that a human may have in terms of diagnostics, for example, X-ray, CAT scans, etc., cancer screenings. I think that is probably going to be one of the key areas we're going to see an immediate benefit. In finance, again, I'm seeing a lot of, and again, I won't name them, a lot of large financial institutions, banks, and everything else, sitting on these copious amounts of data, right? And the first thing that they're doing is they're saying, let's ingest this data, which is great. And then they're trying to figure out, how do we automate the ingest of the data? And then how do we use that to effectively interact on one hand with our customers, which I think is the easiest thing to do. I think if you think about it from an interaction perspective, the first area that you're going to notice AI improvement, I think, from a finance perspective, is your chatbot, right? You had your old chatbots that were very kind of limited. Nowadays, you're slowly approaching the perspective where you might not even be able to tell if it's a human or not. Obviously, you're going to suspect it's AI. So you have a whole sector, I think, that's going to benefit. Less, let's call it, critically important, but again, if you're in the industry, it's going to be significant to you, is retail. I think you're seeing, to the detriment, and I'll say this, the detriment of customers and consumers, you're seeing some of that utilization being placed, for example, for pricing. Now, a lot of companies are trying to turn around and say, when you walk in, your burger might not cost $5 anymore. It might cost $7 at 10 a.m. It might cost $12 at noon, and it might cost $4 at 4 p.m. So they're trying to actually use AI in every tool set possible to actually improve their, obviously, revenues, improve their optimization. But at the same time, I think they may be not factoring as strongly as they should the impact on humans. And I think that'll bring us to the next, hopefully, point of our conversation is, what are some of the considerations when we use AI beyond the technical aspect? Because technology, believe it or not, you can always hire somebody. As long as you have copious amounts of data, you obviously train your model, you build the right model, you test it, you have an effective pilot, et cetera, you will be able to build an AI tool set and an AI solution. The question that's going to come around is, who's going to have it? Who's going to deploy it? How's it going to be used? What's the transparency associated with it? And what's going to be the impact of those around it?
Right. And you know what, Bane, you bring up so many great points here. Let me just try to unpack a couple of things, or go back to a couple of things. You know, as far as eliminating human error, I think that's where AI really shines. And I think, especially when you talk about the healthcare industry, I find it to be the most, revolutionizing as far as what can happen in that industry. The other point that you mentioned about the chatbots, just a funny little story. Just this past weekend, I was on the phone, I thought with a human. This is for a cruise line, and we're interacting, going back and forth. And at one point, I actually kind of paused and looked at my husband. I said, I'm not sure if I'm talking to a person or to a robot, but this robot is very, very knowledgeable. So definitely has come a long way from what we have seen. Which kind of then leads me to, what the mistake of AI, what is it? Is it machine learning, automation? It's a tool, as we've talked about, right? It's a tool. And how do you utilize this tool? But of course, there's some ethical considerations which you were kind of alluding to. And maybe you can share a little bit from your perspective, some of the ethical dilemmas that we face.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, I think, the one area that I believe is going to experience a backlash from an AI, and that's HR, human resources, right? A lot of companies are starting to use AI. The most common, let's call it, form of screening has been the ATS system, right? Which is basically keywords and what have you not. But I think a lot of them are now trying to deploy AI in an HR environment. There's great risk associated here because not only could you potentially have a model that is discriminatory, but it's also not inclusive. And more importantly, may not necessarily reflect your ability to attract the best talent, screen the right best talent, and give everybody, let's call it, a fair chance. So I think you have an issue, first of all, in terms of building a model, an AI model that is going to be inclusive, that is going to be fair, it's going to be transparent. But here's the risk. So when you talk about AI, a lot of people say, well, we want to have transparency in terms of how the AI model is built. Well, before we even get to that, the first question is, are you going to use proprietary design or are you going to use open source tool sets? So even if we move past that, the issue then becomes in terms of transparency, how can you be transparent enough with your model without opening yourself up to, for example, somebody copying your idea or stealing your, shall we say, model, or worse, using that knowledge to infiltrate your model and change your model. So I think one of the dangers in terms of AI from that perspective, and the one that I dread and the one that I'm actually seeing, is the utilization from an HR perspective. The second aspect that I'm also somewhat concerned is, and I think you and I talked about this briefly, is affecting the power of AI. That, and we've seen it on television, and I'll say kids will be kids, teenagers will be teenagers, and what have you not. But there's the old adage, AI has the potential almost being your own personal nuclear reactor. Now, how comfortable would you feel if I told you that a little Timmy down the block has a nuclear reactor in his basement? I don't think you'd be that happy. And now imagine if a lot of Timmys and Janes and Samanthas and what have you not had their own little nuclear reactors. To some extent, that's what you're saying. One of the more common elements is the availability of tool sets that are built by AI, for example, to use, I'm going to call it body shaming, but really what it is, it's a form of pornography where people will take images, overlay images, and pretend that they belong to a certain person. And it's causing a lot of friction. And that is just one tiny slice of how AI can be utilized unscrupulously. Now, imagine you go even a little bit further in terms of docs, in terms of social pressure, in terms of fake news, in terms of, deep fakes. It's getting to the point that I believe the next revolution in AI, and one of the things I'm actually fascinated with, is to have an AI that's going to determine whether the content is AI driven and how much of the content that you're getting is actually verifiable and correct. We are, I think, at the very, shall we say, cusp of that level where everything that you're going to see may become suspect unless you have a way to verify that what you're getting is actually unbiased and fair. And that, I think, is the biggest danger of AI. That AI per se can bring great benefits, but not to quote Elon or anybody else, it also represents, I firmly believe, one of the greatest dangers to humanity that we've faced in a long time. Speaking of the movies with Oppenheimer, everybody understood what a nuclear weapon is. AI is much worse than a nuclear weapon because it can be insidious, it's fast, it can spread very rapidly, and it can affect us in ways that is unimaginable at this point.
Right. Well, and Bane, as you're saying this, I'm kind of thinking it's like, but isn't this the case with, I don't want to say blanket statement, all technology, but when you have something that's kind of revolutionary or truly changing an industry significantly from where it was, there's the good and the bad that comes with it. And this is where I think parameters have to be, governing parameters need to be put in place, and, security measures around it. So, what suggestions do you want to share with the audience as far as, like the ethical governance that companies should look at instilling and adopting and adapting to?
Well, can't say that I'm the first person who's had this idea. I think it goes further back. I mean, I remember as a kid reading Isaac Asimov and the Three Laws of Robotics, right? Even back then, they had these concerns associated with it. I think my humble suggestion is as follows, and the challenges associated with it, and I'll see if I can kind of articulate correctly what I think. One, there has to be a legislative, what I would say, guidelines. Let's call it a sandbox, right? Whether that is based on ethics, whether that is based on capability. In other words, the old adage, anybody can ride a moped that goes under 30 miles an hour, but if you want to ride, a Ducati that goes 180 miles an hour, you need a license, right? So maybe there should be a form of licensing associated when you build certain AI capabilities into it. Second thing that I think is also going to be curious to see how we resolve it. This is not the problem that we have in the United States. This is a global problem. So what happens if you try to implement a legislative structure that is going to, effectively throttle down your innovation? You can't do that because other countries won't. So I think the next step beyond that is accessibility. In other words, how do we ensure that you can develop whatever the hell you want to be able to develop, but should you be releasing it in the wild, and what kind of an effect that has? So if there are certain, let's call it entities, that operate wherever they may operate, like in Atlantis, let's make it up. If they operate in Atlantis without naming anybody, should Atlantis have access then to an environment that is perhaps bound by more ethical laws? Again, we're dealing with a situation that can very quickly and rapidly escalate in that respect. So I think first and foremost, one, I would say again, having some sort of a legislative, not constriction, but let's call it a sandbox associated with it. Two, I would even go so far as to say for certain AI aspects, especially some harmful aspects, there should be some form of, let's call it exclusion or firewall, if you want to put it in that perspective. And the third thing is education. I'll give you an example of a study that I read. There was a very talented group of scientists out in the West Coast that, and I won't mention the company, but some of your readers will be able to Google it and find it, that they effectively built two independent AI boxes. Let's call them boxes, right? They were not connected to the outside world. And they decided to connect the two boxes, the two AI models, to each other, and effectively gave them the ability to interact, but they had no common protocols. These two AI models, and this is where I told you where the risk is the self-learning aspect of it, developed a language of their own that we could not interpret. They were communicating. What they were communicating, we couldn't tell. So let's take that a step further. Beyond everything that I've said, whatever model we develop has to be human-centric. What do I mean by human-centric? Oversight by humans. Not only just oversight by humans, but effectively constant monitoring to make sure that this does not go rogue on us. We could end up going by the way of the dodo or the dinosaurs if we are really careful and we don't have the necessary oversight. I cannot stress that enough. I have seen the potential to really cause headaches. And what I'm afraid of is what happens when you have, let's call it a decentralized global AI model. So it's not centralized. It's not in one location that, for example, drop a cruise missile and say, yeah, done, no more problem. What happens when you have a decentralized model that decides that humanity represents a threat? Or decides, you know what, to quote, and I'm really going to age myself because I remember seeing it as a kid, to quote an old movie, I've been named president for life and did a decree that every Tuesday everybody should wear their underwear on the outside of their pants, right? I mean, ludicrous, hilarious, but there's a certain logic associated with it. So my fear really is allowing AIs to go out into the, let's call it, this digital world that we live in, unfiltered, unmonitored, unverified. Everybody's heard about computer hallucinations. So what happens when you have a global AI model that decides to hallucinate and decides to implement something we're not ready for? That is my big fear. That is really my big fear and my big caution. I don't think we need to worry about it for the next 5 to 10 years. But for those who are listening, who remember, the old adage of Moore's Law about the increase in computational power, that's been going past where I think at warp speed at this point in time. So if I say 10 years, it might be 5, it might be 3, I don't know. There are some very, very, very talented individuals out there that are putting everybody else to shame in terms of what they're coming up with. And I just implore them that as they do this, think long and hard. And again, I didn't come up with this phrase, just because you can do it, should you do it? And then if you do, this again, I for one don't want to upset our AI overlords, but I have to say it. Actually, hopefully you can build some sort of a kill switch that the AI cannot disable. And what I'm afraid of, what happens when the AI is sufficiently advanced and decides, oh, wait a second, you built a kill switch. So those are the challenges we face. And I'm not quite sure that I have all the answers, but I'm seeing them develop. So in the short term, what I tell companies that I work with, executives that I sit and advise, I tell them, look, we can solve your, let's call it short-term needs. We can solve your commercial requirements. Not an issue. The next few years, we can really revolutionize what you're doing. And if you don't have AI, you are not going to be competitive. So let's put that in place. But at the same time, I think a lot of them are also forgetting that as they're building out this solution, they also need to build a level of, let's call it, protection and ethics and responsibility behind it. A lot of them are, most of them I would say are. But again, it's a conversation we need to have. I'm glad we're having it now.
All right. Well, Bane, it kind of leads me then to, ask you about security, right? With everything that we've been talking about, and you've kind of alluded to, having basically guardrails and a firewall around it. But security is a major concern in this digital age, and the complexity and the layers associated with that. What specific security issues do you see arising from the use of AI, and what measures can organizations take to mitigate these risks?
I would say the risks can be categorized as internal, external, and AI-driven risks. So your internal risks are, I think what organizations to some extent are somewhat familiar with, but internally having somebody manipulate your model or manipulate whatever you've built, or manipulate your access to your model for whatever means they want to have in place. So again, access and the ability to manipulate the model is going to be important. The other risks they're going to face, and they're probably facing, is how valid is the data that you're importing? You can build a fantastic AI model, but if your data is not, let's call it secure, if your data is not accurate, if your data is not, let's call it validated, guess what? You are going to have a big security risk right then and there. So that's the other security risk. External, you have issues which we're all familiar with, which is, you're hacking, or let's call it network penetration. But here's the insidious part of the AI model. When somebody who's a bit more sophisticated, we're not talking the script babies, talking about somebody who's a little bit more sophisticated, goes into your AI model and is able to hijack it, you are going to have some serious issues associated with it, because not only are they going to be able to hijack your model, they're going to be able to hijack your data, they're going to be able to manipulate your data, they're going to effectively hold you ransom beyond the denial of service. So for example, we've all seen and heard on the news, on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, what have you not, how some of these organizations have had to pay. Let's see the latest one, in the car industry. They had to pay millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars to be able to effectively get themselves unhijacked. Let's use that term. Well, AI has a more insidious capability. You might not even know that you've been hijacked. Somebody could be working to undermine your business, both short-term and long-term. So that's another aspect. And then the other security aspect that I kind of talk about is, I mentioned before, inclusiveness and fairness, right? Are you going to be programming something, or are you going to be deploying something that's going to be inclusive, fair, and have the capability to integrate with your legacy systems and effectively leverage your legacy systems accurately? So I think from a security standpoint, those are, let's call it, some of the more common key areas that are associated. But you have some other issues as well. You have scalability issues. Are you going to be able to scale? Have you taken into account your power consumption issues? What that is going to look like? Have you taken into account the training that you're going to have to give to your users associated with it? So whatever, let's call it, your CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, has been doing yesterday, I assure you that the individual in this particular instance is probably buying themselves an extra large jar of Advil or Tylenol, because they unfortunately, and this is I'm not a CISO, but I know quite a few of them. Unfortunately, they have a tremendous amount of responsibility. They will have a tremendous amount of blame associated with it, but nobody really gives them the credit and I would even go so far as to say the resources until it's too late. So I think beyond product and project, I think InfoSec is going to be the third pillar of, let's call it, an effective AI policy.
Yeah, Bane, you really kind of hit the nail on the head when you talk about the role of the CISO. I remember, like 2 decades ago, it was almost non-existent, to now it's probably the most critical role within an organization, and the one that will get blamed if there's any hiccup in, uptime or any kind of breach of security. So definitely not a role that is easy. And you need to have strong intestinal fortitude to be able to handle day in and day out, for sure. Bane, I did want to ask, as we're kind of wrapping up here, beyond what we've discussed, are there any other thoughts or insights you have on AI? For instance, how do you see power utilization requirements or the speed of AI development, the talent needed to drive this innovation and possible commercial outcomes evolving in the near future?
That's an interesting observation, because on one hand, AI is going to eliminate a lot of jobs. I mean, that's a sad thing, right? But on the other hand, I think it's also going to potentially create a lot of opportunities. So what I would say is this: for the new generation that's coming up, technology is going to be a huge driver. More to the point, what I would say is this: if you are going to get into this field, realize one thing above all: you're going to be a student for the rest of your life. I literally feel like I'm going to school on a daily basis, and I am absolutely blown away by some savants that are coming out of the woodwork. So I think that would be the first bit of advice that I would actually put out there. Now, from an economic standpoint, you mentioned power utilization. I would say even beyond power utilization, you're talking about some, let's call it, rare earth elements also that are going to come into play. So I think there's going to be another dynamic in terms of commodities and grids. I hate to say this, but unless we develop cold fusion, we are going to have to activate more nuclear power plants, just purely because I think our power grid requirements are going to skyrocket, and renewable energy at this stage is still not going to be able to keep up that quick. Also, I think what you're going to find is you're going to find that a lot of these, let's call it, data centers that are going to be tied in directly with AI, because AI is going to be tied in directly, are going to try to co-locate themselves as close as possible to stable, plentiful power supplies. So for all those state governments, all those, let's call it, countries that are looking to attract AI technology will attract your big players. Really, what it's going to come down to is, can you offer them cheap, steady, reliable power in order to be able to have them scale effectively? And then the last thing that I would also say is this, and this is going to be kind of like a, how do I put this politely? An oxymoronic statement is a good way to put it. On one hand, you're going to have AI get significantly cheaper, but on the other hand, I think AI is going to become so much more expensive and potentially class divisive. In other words, those who have the capability to deploy the best AI, whether it is in their work, whether it's their social lives, what have you not, are going to have a leg up on those who don't. And then equally put in that respect, what kind of impact does that have on society in terms of where we're heading and where we're going? So again, exciting times, but interesting times. But like an old ancient curse says, may you live in interesting times. We'll see.
All right. Well, listen, I think, my goodness, we could probably talk for at least another couple of hours on this subject, because there's so many layers and so many complexities to be able to, share with the audience. But if you were to leave the audience with one power word, what would you leave them with?
Ooh, that's a very, very good question. Adaptability.
Adaptability. That's actually, it summarizes everything that we've talked about really nicely. Bane, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Anna, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll talk again.
Thanks for joining us on the AI to Z podcast with Anna Frazzetto. If you found value in today's episode, consider following for more insightful STEM discussions. We'll be back with another deep dive. Until then.